Dear audience, welcome and thank you for looking at this presentation called Worlds Apart. My name is Willemijn van Kempen and I'm a researcher concerning transgender asylum procedures in the Netherlands and an advocate on behalf of Transgender Network. This video is a retake of the recording during the International Asylum Conference called Believe It or Not in September 2024. I will share my observations during this presentation regarding the negative credibility assessment in Zee Salem's transgender asylum case. She is an Egyptian trans woman whose country of origin prosecutes LGBTI persons actively under a public order and morality law. The asylum request on the grounds of her gender identity was preceded by two procedures as a political asylum seeker where her trans identity was not revealed. Her transgender asylum application was rejected because she was not considered credible regarding her gender identity. This negative decision was upheld in the first appeal. In the run-up to the final appeal before the Council of State, I became involved together with Transgender Network and Sabine Jansen on behalf of the Dutch LGBT organization COC Nederland and worked together with the asylum lawyer. Among other texts, my written analysis and rebuttal of the hearing and assessment in this case was submitted to the Council of State in the final appeal. According to the asylum lawyer, my rebuttal contributed strongly to flipping the case around. The Secretary of State withdrew the negative decision in Zee's case. This was good news for Zee, and at the same time, it is highly probable that it was withdrawn to preclude negative jurisprudence for the Secretary of State. And it was 19 months later when an additional hearing followed that led to Zee being deemed credible in her trans identity and receiving a refugee status. This case is of interest for several reasons. First of all, it is new that trans asylum seekers cases appear that come from countries criminalizing them where the credibility of their gender identity is contested. Secondly, it is a very vivid example of the core theme of the conference, the rigid use of Western stereotypical identity concepts that dominate this asylum procedure. And thirdly, it contains several specific problems when it comes to questioning and assessing a gender identity. Now, after this introduction, we can have a look at the main issues in this case. And the first one is that questioning Zee's identity is based on stereotypical Western expectations of how a trans person's identity will develop and is narrated. To put it short, it is expected that she went through a process of awareness, inner struggle, leading to a self-acceptance about her own identity. When someone can elaborate on these processes in an explicit and cognitive way, this adds to the credibility of their identity. But the absence of such stereotypical narratives, in Zee's case, contributed strongly to the negative credibility assessment. These expectations simply did not resonate with Zee's life and narration, and she did not voice a big inner struggle and did not give very long explanations. I will cite some questions by the hearing officer in the hearing here to give an impression how they search for these concepts. So question 1. Applicant starts talking about transformation, but I ask the applicant to stay with the question for a moment and not focus on appearances, but on his inner process. Question 2. I reformulate the question about the person concerned, stating that transsexuality was not an issue for him when he was young, but that it is quite a big thing to realize that. Question 3. You have said before that being transsexual is not such an issue for you, but that it is dangerous in your country of origin. You talk about it as if being transsexual is not special to you, but at the same time it is for many other people. How does this relate to each other? Question 4. the question was not about how others feel about it in Egypt, but about how you personally feel about it. You just confirmed again that it was not a problem for you yourself. So the asylum officer's questions tend to steer, correct, and scold her, especially when they does not tick the Western stereotypical boxes for the officer. And then the decision in the text, the negative outlook on not finding these concepts is also evident. And I cite some fragments of the decisions here. Nowhere does he express feelings of doubt during the inner process of realizing his gender identity towards accepting his gender identity. Another one, he does not provide insight into his feelings about the realization of a sex change, nor concerning the desire, thoughts, and awarenesses of the way to a sex change. And another one, that he has a different gender identity was not an issue for him at all. This is very remarkable, because a gender change entails a drastic change of identity in every way, both externally and internally. So the decision again is filled with judgments for not finding the stereotypical narrative and criticism for the way he does not voice that. The expectations were very much in contrast with Zay's authentic non-Western narrative and expressions, and they are worlds apart, hence the name of this presentation. Besides the problematic expectation of a stereotypical Western narrative, Zay is misgendered in the asylum procedure, as you may have heard, using male pronouns, which is disruptive to the perception of her identity. And when we turn to the Dutch working instruction for asylum officers and their posture towards the asylum seeker, the following is said. It is important to get the authentic individual story out in the hearing. Hearing officers should adopt an uninhibited attitude during the interview and avoid reasoning from a personal, often Western, frame of reference as much as possible. Ask about the personal experiences of the foreign national and the personal meaning that these events have had. Asylum officers are called to try to connect as much as possible with the level and manner of telling the story of the stranger and his frame of reference. And as you may hear, the contrast of these working instructions for asylum officers with the reality of the asylum procedure is enormous. Another problem in the credibility assessment is not opening up to the Egyptian Islamic context. One example I can give here now is that when relationships are questioned in the hearing, Zay talks about meeting her trans female partner inside in a discreet way and explaining why they choose to stay inside. She mentioned how they could express their female selves inside, whereas outside was either a grave danger to express their femininity or a place where they felt fake when having to act male. But this was not accepted by the hearing officer. Instead, the officer suggests that a real and valid relationship requires doing things outside the house and having plans for the future. In the assessment, the relationship is discredited for not fulfilling the hearing officer's Western demands of a relationship. Zay's authentic Egyptian Islamic context and reality is simply blatantly neglected. There are also very specific transgender related issues in the hearing. When Zay talked about transition related topics and female expression in the hearing, the officer steered away from them and made it seem as if she was only talking about outward appearance. And this devaluates such conversations by Zay and makes them less compared to the desired stereotypical Western inner processes. It is important to realize that in Zay's cultural context, the Egyptian Islamic reality she comes from, the concept of transsexuality, is not always the typical Western one. Being a transsexuality may not be founded as much on the inner conviction of a person as in the Western context, but instead something you do. You become a transsexual by taking physical transition steps that validate someone as a transsexual. Therefore, telling that you take steps or intend to take steps to take hormones and breast enhancement may be a way to validate your own transsexuality in the audience that you tell it to, in her context. Then again about misgendering, it was mentioned and she was addressed as a male in writing and in person, which is called misgendering. And a correct and gendered approach towards say was not ensured by the asylum officer. And so that also makes it a risk that the asylum officer does not open up to the gender identity, and it may reveal resistance to do so. And this is inaccurate, since the Secretary of State set a norm about misgendering in statements. In statement it is said that misgendering a trans person is a painful mistake to be avoided. A trans person should be addressed by the preferred name, gender and pronoun regardless of the passport. But these statements have not been implemented. To the contrary, they gets the blame in the decision, in the text for the misgendering, when the text says, "What is also surprising is that the person concerned who claims to see himself as a woman did not ask the employee if he wanted to address him as Mrs." And this is not totally true, because in the hearing it is said that she says, "I want to change that to female instead of male." Another point is that there is confusion about the asylum ground. They stated clearly to be a transsexual person from the hearing start, but despite that, the hearing officer claimed to be confused whether the procedure dealt with a sexual orientation or gender identity. Tension arose in the hearing about the official form that only has one box that says orientation for all LGBT identities, but Say was scrutinized as if she left gender identity out, but Say did not construct the form, and an asylum reception officer filled it out, and this burdened the case. The fact that the officer picked a fight about the form was probably caused by the officer not perceiving Zay visibly to be a transsexual or a woman. This became clear in a remark by the asylum officer later in the hearing. Zay was aware of the vulnerability that not presenting explicitly female at the hearing could endanger her credibility. And therefore she explained in the hearing how she did not feel safe to dress and express female on the way and back to the hearing and back coming from the hearing, since she had to leave and return to a hostile asylum center. The fallout of this tension in the conversation damaged the hearing and returned in negative assessments about it in the decision. And also it is very likely that Say, being perceived not to look the part as a trans woman, influenced the hearing and assessment negatively. And I want to elaborate somewhat on the topic of looking the part, because 19 months later in the additional hearing, Say presented as a female. And the contrast with the negative decision earlier couldn't be larger. Her situation had changed enormously and she was well into transition. She took hormones, she had her name and gender changed in gender marker changed in her official paper, and she was out and about 24/7, being very active in LGBT organizations. And the vast majority of questions by the hearing officer in the additional hearing was completely different than in the previous hearing. The questions dealt with and sought confirmation of the trans identity in the transition process, something that they rejected in the last one. You should not talk about transition process, you should talk about the inner aspects. But here, all the time confirmation is sought that the trans identity is valid by talking about transition process. Questions centered on hormone treatment, healthcare, the fear she overcame, how she expressed as a female 24/7, and the official registration she obtained as a female with a new first name. All of a sudden, what was seen previously as exterior technicalities was now questioned as supporting evidence. However understandable the search for such support as evidence is, it points to the transitioning trans person holding an advantage in credibility. And I want to note that this leaves non-binary and trans persons that are not in transition at a huge disadvantage and risk regarding their credibility assessment. Yet another topic is the lack of differentiation from LGBT persons that I also mentioned when it comes to having only one category in the form. But this is a more generalized issue. It is not only present in the official application form, where orientation was a single container for LGBT identities, but it's also very present in the working instruction, where sexual orientation is the box, the conflated term to depict all LGBT identities for 20, and it's done 24 times in the working instruction. And the working instruction contains no specific wording or approach to a trans identity. Okay, now we come to another topic that is questioning relationships and sexual orientation. It is not evident in itself to question relations and sexual orientation in trans cases that are concerned with gender identity, but it appears more as a remnant of the past that focused on LGBT persons and is not differentiated for the gender identity. In Zay's case, it is argued that relationships and sexual orientation are relevant because Zay mentioned it strengthened her wish to transition. While this may hold some truth, that is not how the questioning and assessment in the procedure actually looked at the relationships. She was deemed not to be credible in her relationships on grounds that were not related to the relationship strengthening her trans identity, but on grounds like sexual motivation of the relationship and not going out together. And then another point is that Zay's sexual orientation drew criticism, since she defined her sexual orientation as being attracted to born men that have become transsexual women, explicitly not being born women, and while not perceiving herself as gay. In the decision, she was criticized because saying she was not gay did not fit the Western definition that if you are a trans woman, having relationships with a trans woman, you are to be seen as lesbian and therefore gay. And at that moment, Zay would not have got it out of her mouth that she would be a lesbian. A final element I want to add here is that her late disclosure in third instance met with disbelief, why she would have refrained from mentioning her trans identity earlier, which is a more common problem if you come up with your identity in a repeated asylum request. So I hope you gained an impression of the accumulation of flaws in the procedures hearing and the assessment that, and according to me, they disqualified it. And it was certainly not executed in accordance with Working Instruction 2019/17. And the whole accumulation of flaws and don't even add an aspect of violence to the way this asylum procedure is conducted towards Zay Salem. And trans people deserve better. The inquiry into their experience and circumstances demand a specific, informed, and differentiated approach in their asylum procedures. I thank you for your attention.